Hi, my name is Bridget Richardson. I'm the Assistant Director of Ecumenical and Pastoral Initiatives at the Nesty Center for Faith and Culture at University of St. Thomas in Houston. And I'm here today with Father John Huber, the Director of Catholic Education at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, and also Father Paul English. He's the Director of Novices for the Basilian Fathers. So thank you both so much for joining me today. It's fun to be with the Basilians.
Happy to be with you again, Bridget.
And today we're going to talk about the common good and justice, specifically surrounding the death of George Floyd and also the nationwide protests and racism. So, Father Huber, if you just want to kick it off discussing the common good and justice and why you feel it's so important to talk about those foundational things at this time.
Perhaps it'd be best to put it in the perspective of our Christian and Catholic teaching on the dignity of every human life. And you don't hear much argument. You won't hear a Catholic say, oh no, I don't believe in the dignity of human life. Of course, we all believe in the dignity of human life, but then we have to take a closer look at what areas in our life, in our culture, in our country, in our world, is the dignity of human life offended or compromised or minimized in any way. And so I think a lot of us have been thinking over the past week as we watch the protests after the horrendous murder of that, remind me of his name, George
Floyd.
George Flynn in Minnesota, and we're disturbed obviously by that image and that picture. And you know, when I was brushing my teeth this morning, I was thinking, you know, of the many things I'm afraid of as a middle-aged white male, I've never really had a fear that the police are going to harm me. You know, I've always had this inside myself, the feeling that if I need to, the police are always going to help me. That's never even been on my radar screen. But it got me thinking, because I've taught as a teacher in Catholic schools, I've taught a number of African American young men and women, and they have offered me a different perspective of what they have had to live through, you know, just walking into, say, a 7-Eleven or a grocery store, and they can't walk down a couple aisles without being followed because they're not trusted. And when we talk about, again, our Christian values as far as upholding the dignity of all human life, I think that that's a very particular way that our culture, in so many ways, has offended that basic Christian principle and that teaching of Jesus Christ. And it's really come home to roost these past few days as we watch the images on television.
And Father Paul, did you have any response to that?
Well, I so agree with what Father John is saying. I watched a video. Father Brian Massengale spoke this past week. And one of the things that he said that stands out for me, it's a line that will remain forever with me, is that the only reason for racism's persistence is that white people continue to benefit from it. And, you know, these past few weeks in particular, but over several years now, being more and more aware of how people with brown skin are treated as something less than people with white skin. It's one thing to be troubled by it, but it's another thing to understand that I'm benefiting all the time from it. And as long as I think that things are equal, things will never change. So I need to learn what Father Massengale was talking about, and as do we all. And I think that's, as Catholics and as Christians, we say that life is precious, and we don't decide which color life is precious. We believe that our God has made each one of us very special and precious. And so this for me is one of those times that we have to turn our lives around, especially those of us who have that kind of power, and use it in a way that will make a difference so that we can get to what God has intended in the first place.
And both of you deal so often with young people. Father Huber, you mentioned, the diversity in the students you've been with, and also Father Paul, I know that you've dealt with a lot of different types of diversity. How have you seen some of this racism acted out in your students? And also, how would you even counsel students, Christian students, and just people of goodwill to work through this? Because I know young people, they're raging right now. Whether, it's really beautiful to see that it's not only African American young people, it's young people of all races that are just so upset and angry that this is still a part of who we are as Americans. So how would you both counsel them, and what have you seen in your experience that you hope that we can work against?
I'm incredibly inspired by some of the images I've just seen in the past 2 days. There was a group, they're showing every city like every 30 seconds. And so it's hard to remember what was happening in which city. I remember what happened in Washington because that's a little different. But there was a group, I think it was in Washington yesterday, where they just all laid down for 9 minutes straight in silence because it was 9 minutes or 9.5 minutes that George had that police officer's foot on his neck or knee, I guess. And there was another group. It's very inspiring because the marchers are overwhelmingly young and incredibly diverse. And so I find that very, very hopeful. I really think that in the younger generation, the vast majority are very upset by this and don't understand how this racism can exist in our modern culture and in the modern day. I was thinking back when I taught for 6 years at our Basilian school in Oakland, California, which is probably the most diverse school I've been at. And I was telling my students a story of driving through Chicago once, and I got off the wrong exit, and I was in an impoverished neighborhood. And as I'm driving down the street, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I got to get out of here before somebody, does something. And there were 3 tall African-American men that were waving at me like this. And I thought, all right, I'm going to get carjacked. My life is over, da-da-da-da. And it turned out that I was going the wrong way down a one-way street. And they were just waving at me like, I needed to turn around because I was in danger. But it was like my automatic fear kicked in. And I don't think if they were, 5'10", white with blue eyes, I would have had the same reaction. And I told this to the class, and one of the African-American students raised his hand and he said, if that would have happened to me, I might have reacted the same way, which I had never thought of either. But, I'm very inspired by just seeing the young people react in such a way. What bothers me a little bit is that I was talking to another former student who actually contacted me. It was on Facebook because he put a very just post up on Facebook that really reflected our Christian values as far as looking at the value of all human life. And all I did was like it, and then I scrolled down and continued. And he sent me this long text afterwards. I hadn't talked to him in 15 years probably. And, and first of all, that he was surprised that I had liked his post. But then secondly, telling me that he was no longer Christian or Catholic, he's an agnostic. And most of the reason was because the majority of Christians that he knows in his life, he wouldn't want to emulate. And that makes me really sad that we find within our own church and those who claim to believe in Jesus's gospel that certain racist attitudes or any kind of attitude that is contrary to raising up the dignity of every single human being without exception, that can exist in people who worship and who believe in Jesus, who believe in the gospel. And what's the most upsetting to me is that turns young people off and then they abandon Christianity. And Christianity teaches what they believe, but not all of us Christians model that in everything that we do and everything that we say and the ways in which we treat one another.
Father Paul, did you?
Bridget, for many years, and since the first part of my priesthood, I've been working well, a lot of the time with Hispanic people, I speak Spanish. It's a name like English, you know. And it's been one of the great privileges of my life to be able to work with people, many of whom came legally and are naturalized citizens in this country, are working at that. But it's also been an important thing to get to know people who are not here legally, or whose documents are no longer in place, that kind of thing. Because what's added to the fact that they tend to have a skin color that's identifiable as not white, they also, a lot of people have to live in the shadows and have to be fearful not only of police, but pretty much of signing up for things that any of us, black or white, might feel comfortable doing, letting our names be known or stand for anything. There's a kind of a living in the shadows life that it's another thing that kind of breaks my heart, because I think we have a beautiful and rich country here that has an awful lot to offer to everyone. And if we would fix, the immigration system in such a way that we could welcome people who have gifts to bring us, and whose situations are so tenuous that they feel they need to leave their beautiful homes, I think things could be better. And so for me anyway, to be able to minister with these people, to hear their stories, to have my heart broken by a lot of the things that are there. Again, these are things that challenge me because I haven't had to deal with any of that. That's just not part of my life at all. One of my favorite writers, and now his writing in these days kind of comes up all the more, is an African-American writer named Ta-Nehisi Coates. He has written some things that are so helpful for me to understand what the experience of a black man in this country is. And it challenges me because one of his points is that it's not the responsibility of a black person to teach white people. That's adding one more burden. That in fact, what we need to do is listen. What we white people need to do is listen. I think we all do, actually. Listen to each other, hear what each person is living and going through, looking at things from the lens, as Christians anyway, of the gospel, and then saying, I need to change. I need to be part of a change in this society. And so that goes kind of across the board. There's a young man who's part of our novitiate who's Filipino, and so he has an Asian look to him. And he was nervous, in March when people were blaming Asians for the coronavirus. I mean, there's so many ways in which we can exhibit hate toward one another, but it's so irrational. It feels to me like we need to bring Christ into so many of these situations and look through a different lens.
And I think both of you are touching on two things that are at play here. Father Paul, you're talking about the system and immigration and changing that. And the only thing that my mind goes to is voting, right? That's the only thing that empowers us to change the system. And then Father Huber, in mentioning Christians, I'm reminded of Bishop Barron's homily for Pentecost. And he talked about how Christians aren't doing a good job. We need to do better. He just called it for what it is. So maybe we can have a conversation about where those two come together, how Christians do a better job through their service of voting, through their faithful citizenship. How do you see that playing out and being effective?
And that's a real challenge, because if you were exclusively to vote for candidates who reflected 100% of our Catholic beliefs, you'd have no one to vote for. And so sometimes you have to vote for the, I don't want to say that the candidate that offends you the least, but that you can support the most because it matches more of what our Christian values are than the other candidate. And that's really difficult. And I think we have a tendency sometimes to ally ourselves with one political party or another. And then once we do that, we're very willing to forgive everything that's wrong that comes out from that political party. And you could find on both sides the way that life is offended and the dignity of life is offended. And I don't think there's a pro-life party, for example, that's 100% pro-life. Because for as much as we want to protect each human being from womb to tomb and every step in between, I don't think it's pro-life to separate immigrant children from their parents and then to lock them up at the border for months at a time. Nor do I think it's right just to automatically think that abortion is a right that we just don't have to think about anymore. And I think there's been a tendency in our culture in particular, not exclusive to our culture, but I think it's worse in our American culture right now, that there's a hierarchy in the value of human life. And that whatever the majority demographic is at the time, which right now is white, although that's changing, that's somehow at the top. And then, you know, makes me think of, I don't know, I was watching last week an old World War II movie and talked about when the Nazis were controlling France, and if a Nazi soldier was shot, that equaled 10 French citizens, and so they killed 10 French citizens, as if, you know, one life of one nationality was worth 10 of another. And we're not so sad if it's, you know, a poor person with brown skin that comes from another culture that we don't think is going to contribute much to society, although that's a judgment we're making as well. But that we have to be very, very careful if we're truly going to say that I believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ. We have to open up and read it on a regular basis and contemplate it in light of the situations of our life and our culture that are going on at the time. There's a reason that we read the same readings at Mass year after year after year after year, because I don't think anyone can say I've gotten to a point in my life where I have fully incorporated all the teachings of Jesus and never do anything wrong now. So that's why we do that. And I think sometimes there's a little too much dust on our Bibles at home, and that we need to, you know, and we need to, you know, not only pay attention to the readings of the homily at Mass, but also to do our own scriptural reading, our own spiritual reading, because we're Christians 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I used to get upset. I was a high school principal at behavior of students at basketball games. And I remember calling them in once after a game, and I said, you cannot check your Christianity at the door, come into the gym and not be Christian for 2 hours, and then go back out and say, all right, I'll be Christian again. We're Christian, and we need to be, and we're called to be Christian in every aspect of our lives, in everything that we do, which means that we don't mock people if they go to another school. We don't make fun of people because they look differently. We don't berate them or belittle them or laugh at them because they believe something different than us, because that's not in alignment with the teachings of Jesus.
Certainly, you know, you don't bully them, you don't do violence to them, you don't deny them a job or a promotion or anything else either for those same reasons. You know, you're absolutely right, Bridget, that one of the major tools that's handed to those of us who are citizens is to vote. We need to understand, though, that our system in this country is a system of representation. It isn't kind of electing people who then go off and do whatever they want. The whole idea is that they are our employees, that we give them their mandate. And so if we elect someone, we have not only every right, but in fact, I think a duty to keep in contact with them and say, you're doing the job I asked you to do, or you're not doing the job, and here's what I want you to do. That's why we're called constituents. We're supposed to be in contact with them and doing things on that political level that we can do. Now, as a priest, as priests, Father John and I, we're not allowed to get involved in electoral politics, but we are certainly, as citizens, required really to let our representatives, even the president, know what it is that we as citizens want the people that we hired to do. And so I think that the false understanding that has been given, and I think promoted in some corners, is that those people that are elected somehow now are free of any influence by the people who voted them in. And that simply is not true. A person who from one party is voted in is responsible to the people in the whole country or county or whatever it is. And so we have the responsibility and the duty really to think of our political job as not only something we do in November once every year or 4 years, but something that, again, every day, especially as people influenced by the gospel, by Jesus, we have a responsibility to bring that to bear in the best way we can in the places of power.
And we were speaking of younger people and how they're inspiring us in these demonstrations, keeping in mind that they're not all looting and burning and
Right.
and being violent. The vast majority of them have been very peaceful, and I think some bad actors from extremist groups have taken advantage of the fact that these people are getting together. And let's not label the whole group who are fighting for justice as these bad actors, because they're not. But for as much as I'm inspired by them as they march through the streets and say their slogans, and actually I've seen quite a few videos of them discouraging looters and trying to convince them not to do what they shouldn't be doing. A majority of the citizens in our country decide not to vote. And unfortunately, that percentage is larger among the younger population. And so as Father Paul was talking about the importance of voting, we should also be encouraging others to take that responsibility seriously, because there are ramifications when the majority stays home. You know, I would hope that every demonstrator I saw that were marching will all be voting as well, because in a democracy, we've been given a blessed responsibility, and we need to live up to that responsibility.
Yeah, it's always surprising to me when you look at the numbers of young voters who aren't voting. And if I may be bold enough to ask, how do we process what we see President Trump doing and representing? How do we process that as Christians? And we can be specific or, talk overarching, but as young Christians, how do we make sense of that and then also do our civic duty to go and make a change?
Bridget, I think anything that we do in the political realm doesn't begin there. I think it begins in our own souls. It begins with our looking at Catholic social teaching, looking at scripture, and then coming together with other people who are people of faith and asking the question, not what does the X, Y, or Z party tell me about my faith, but what does my faith tell me about what's happening in the world, and how is the best way that I, through the political system, what's the best way that I can, help what Christ is calling for to happen in the world. We need to put get the cart and the horse in the right order.
Right, and for as much as, especially during the years of when 9/11 happened, that many of us may have gotten this notion in our heads that all Muslims are terrorists, and some of the young people thinking that all Christians are hypocrites or whatever. That first of all, it's not true. Neither of Muslims nor Christians nor Jews nor Hindus nor Buddhists. We're all people who are following teachings of peace and dignity and respect. That first and foremost, we need to show that in the way that we treat people, in the words that we say, the attitudes that we have, the jokes that we tell, the priorities that we have, and we need to model that. And when we notice it happening in our own communities, we need to contradict it gently, but with dignity, and to remind one another of what we're truly dedicated to, which is peace and justice and righteousness. And because I don't remember any of the good sisters teaching me that God was a white American.
No.
Well, thank you both so much for this very vulnerable and open dialogue about issues that are really hurting people in a lot of different ways, and calling them to deeper reflection. Do you have any final words that you'd like to say on the death of George Floyd, or the protests, or racism in general?
Let me just
There are millions of signs of hope out there. And we see that, and let's allow ourselves to be inspired by that, but not just to sit in front of our TVs and say, I agree, but to do something more, to get up off the chair and do something that's going to really help systemic change.
And just speaking as a clergyman who's had education and all kinds of other things, and white, I'm so convicted now these days that that I have a voice that isn't just how good for me that I have this voice, but it's for other people, especially for people who don't have that voice. And so I need to use it, but not just I would say to all my white brothers and sisters out there, we have a voice that we must use, because if we don't, then we're part of the problem.
And we have a particular responsibility.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much, both of you. I'm so happy to know you and to be taught by you. I can't wait to share this conversation.
Thank you, Bridget. It's always good to talk to you.
Thank you. Thanks for doing this.